Under a regular farm, there's a secret no one was supposed to find. When the ground starts to shake, one discovery will change everything. What would you do if the earth itself began to talk? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The truth is only beginning to come out. The morning started as it always did on Jerome Hale's farm, calm and peaceful under the soft light of sunrise. The horizon opened like a slow breath, and sunlight moved over the cornfields, warming the drops of water that stuck to every plant. Jerome went through his daily routine with careful practice. He had been a farmer his whole life, waking up before the roosters called, his boots tied tight, his hat pulled low, and his eyes clear, with the kind of quiet that only people of the land had. The air was full of the smell of dirt and grain, the buzz of insects still quiet from the night's coolness. Everything felt normal, but in that stillness, something slightly uncomfortable moved beneath the surface. For several days, the animals had been acting strange. The chickens refused to lay eggs, walking around the edges of the coop as if they could sense a storm that hadn't come yet. The cows gathered near the northern fence at night, making nervous sounds, stomping their feet against the ground, as though something beneath them was moving. Jerome told himself it was nothing more than a weather change. The summer had been hotter than normal, and the nights too warm. Still, the worry sat deep in his chest like a small stone under his tongue. He tried to ignore it, to lose it in the pattern of his work, but even the wind felt different, heavier somehow, as if the land were holding its breath. By evening, the air changed. It came from the east, thick and hot, carrying a faint metallic smell. Jerome stood on his porch, watching the grass move in uneven waves, a strange movement that didn't match the direction of the wind. He had lived through droughts and floods, through winters that broke barns in half. But this was new. The earth seemed restless. As the sun dropped behind the hills, he caught a flicker of light across the far field. A reflection, perhaps, or the shine of something buried under the soil. He rubbed his eyes and told himself it was his imagination. When darkness came, the silence got deeper. The house creaked with its usual old complaints. But then, sometime after midnight, a faint shaking rattled the glass on his nightstand. It was small at first, like a distant train passing by, the kind that fades before the mind fully notices it. Jerome turned over, half awake, unsure whether he was dreaming. The second shake left no doubt. The bed shook hard enough to send the lamp crashing to the floor. The sound of groaning would fill the house as if the building itself was gasping for air. He jumped from bed, pulled on his shirt, and stumbled out onto the porch. Outside, the stars seemed to blink. The ground rolled in uneven waves, dirt moving like water under his boots. The windmill near the barn twisted and bent. A sharp crack split the air, a sound like the world breaking open. Jerome grabbed the porch post as the ground beneath him shook again. The noise was ear-splitting, groans from the earth, the cracking of wood, the distant crash of something large falling. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence fell over the farm, thick and complete. Only the beating of his heart filled the emptiness. He stood there for a long time, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The house leaned slightly. The barn door hung off one hinge, and the soil smelled strange, wet, metallic, burnt somehow. His yard was broken by jagged lines that seemed to stretch toward the southern field. He could not see far in the dark, but his gut told him the damage there was worse. He waited until dawn, unable to sleep, his mind spinning between disbelief and worry. When the light finally came back, it came through a sheet of gray clouds. Walking across the field, he followed the cracks until he reached the southern edge of his land. The sight stopped him cold. The earth had opened wide, swallowing part of the fence and a patch of cornstalks whole. It was not a simple crack. It was a wound. A long, wide gap split the soil, its edges sharp and falling inward. Jerome crouched near it, shining his flashlight into the darkness below. The light disappeared quickly, swallowed by shadow. But for a brief second, it caught something smooth and curved, metal, faintly shiny beneath the dust. The air coming from the gap was warm and damp, carrying the same bitter chemical smell he'd noticed the night before. It wasn't natural. He reached down, grabbed a chunk of dirt, and rubbed it between his fingers. It shimmered faintly, as though mixed with oil. His heartbeat quickened. Whatever this was, it didn't belong on a farm. He stood, took a slow step back, and stared into the pit. The tunnel, if that's what it was, seemed too perfect, too planned. Someone had made it. He thought about calling the county, but a strange pause held him back. He'd lived his life trusting the land and not trusting government officials. Outsiders had never done much good for people like him. Instead, he turned toward the farmhouse, mind racing. There was one man he could trust, Henry Morris, his oldest friend. They'd weathered storms together, shared tools, and built fences side by side for decades. If there was something strange buried under his property, Henry would help him figure it out. As the sun climbed higher, Jerome stood on the porch, staring toward the field, the black wound cutting through the green space like a scar that would never heal. The wind moved through the grass again, but this time it seemed to carry a whisper, a low murmur from beneath the ground. The land he had always thought of as steady and loyal now felt alive in a way that scared him. Something had woken up in the earth, something old and hidden. And Jerome Hale knew his life would not go back to normal. He turned toward the house, picked up the phone, and dialed the only number that mattered. Tomorrow, he thought, he would not face the darkness alone. Henry arrived early, his old truck rumbling down the dirt road and scattering dust into the morning air. Jerome was already waiting by the porch, a coil of rope over his shoulder, flashlight clipped to his belt. They didn't need many words. The look on Jerome's face told Henry enough, and the silence between them was the kind that forms only between men who have worked side by side for a lifetime. Together, they walked across the field toward the southern edge, their boots sinking slightly into the soft soil where the ground had shifted. The hole opened before them like the mouth of something ancient, the dark inside it impossibly deep. Henry crouched near the edge, shining his light downward. "That's no ordinary sinkhole," he said quietly. The light reflected off a smooth surface below, curved and metallic, like the skin of a buried machine. Jerome nodded. He had seen it, too. They worked without speaking much. Henry tied the rope to the axle of his truck, testing the knots until he was satisfied. Jerome adjusted his gloves and looped the other end around his waist. "You sure about this?" Henry asked, his voice low. "No," Jerome admitted, "but I need to know what's down there." With that, he began going down. The rope creaked as it held his weight, and dust fell in thin streams from the edge of the hole. The air grew warmer as he lowered himself, heavy and thick, filled with the smell of minerals and something sharp, chemical, almost like burnt oil. When his boots finally touched the bottom, he took a steadying breath and lifted the flashlight. The tunnel stretched out in both directions, impossibly smooth, the walls glistening faintly under the light. They weren't carved by nature, too even, too balanced. Faint lines ran along the surface, forming angled patterns that looked etched or burned. The deeper parts pulsed with faint reflections like veins of black stone threaded with metal. Jerome touched the wall and pulled back quickly. It was warm. "You all right down there?" Henry called from above. "Yeah," Jerome shouted back. "But it's strange. You better come down." Moments later, the rope trembled again as Henry came down, landing with a grunt beside him. The two men stood in the narrow passage, lights cutting through the dark. "Feels like the earth's alive," Henry muttered, running his hand along the shimmering surface. Jerome nodded, unable to find words. The tunnel hummed faintly, not from wind or water, but from something deeper, a steady vibration that throbbed in their bones. They followed it slowly, boots crunching on damp soil. The smell grew stronger, sulfur and oil mixing into a choking fog. Here and there, pieces of trash littered the ground, rusted bolts, broken boards, the remains of old equipment. Then Jerome's light caught something half buried near the wall. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a charred wooden board, blackened by heat. The letters Melbco were barely visible across the surface. Henry crouched beside him, frowning. Some kind of company marking. Jerome turned the piece over, but the rest of the letters were gone. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But what kind of company builds something like this under a farm?" They looked at each other, both knowing there was no simple answer. As they moved farther in, the tunnel widened slightly, and a thin film of yellowish liquid coated the ground, catching their light with an oily shine. The air felt hotter now, pressing down on them like a physical weight. "Something's leaking," Henry said, pointing to a dark patch on the wall where moisture dripped steadily. The drops hissed as they hit the puddles, releasing a faint trail of smoke. They turned a corner and froze. Ahead, the tunnel bent sharply, and beyond that bend came a sound neither of them wanted to hear. A deep, rhythmic pulse, mechanical, deliberate. It was faint but steady, like the heartbeat of a machine buried alive. Jerome swallowed hard. "You hear that?" he whispered. Henry nodded, eyes narrowing. "This isn't abandoned," he said. "Someone's still down here. Or something is." For a moment, they stood still. The only sounds were their breathing and the soft echo of the hum. The walls around them seemed to vibrate in time with it, the black veins flickering faintly in the light. Jerome's flashlight shook as he turned to look back the way they had come. The tunnel behind them was a black throat stretching into nothing. "We should go," Henry said firmly. "Now." They backed away, careful not to slip on the wet ground, following their steps back toward the rope. The deeper air clung to them, thick and heavy, unwilling to let them leave. When they finally reached the base of the shaft, Jerome looked up, his light barely reaching the circle of daylight far above. The air from outside felt almost cold compared to the heat below. "You first," Henry said, gripping the rope. Jerome climbed quickly, the rough ropes burning his hands as he went, desperate for open air. When they came out, the sun had dropped low. The sky was painted in bruised shades of orange and gray. The wind felt wrong, too still, too heavy. Henry climbed out beside him, both men covered in sweat and dirt, the stench of sulfur following them like a curse. They sat on the tailgate of the truck, catching their breath, staring at the hole that now seemed even darker than before. "What do you think they were doing down there?" Henry asked quietly. Jerome didn't answer right away. He turned the burnt board over in his hands, the faded letters shining faintly in the dying light. "Something that shouldn't have been," he said at last. They watched the horizon in silence, the wind whispering through the grass, and somewhere deep below, faint but certain, the earth still hummed. The days after going down passed in a fog of worry. Jerome went about his chores as though in a daze, but his mind was stuck on the black wound in his field. He could not forget the warmth of the tunnel walls or the rhythmic hum that had followed them upward like a whisper. The burned board with the half-erased letters sat on his kitchen table, a silent accusation he couldn't ignore. The smell of sulfur seemed to stay on his clothes even after washing. Finally, unable to stand not knowing, he drove into town and headed for the county records office, a low brick building filled with the stale smell of paper and dust. He explained little to the clerk, who simply pointed him toward a wall of old maps and survey records. For hours, Jerome looked through folders and yellowed papers, tracing the ownership of his land back through time. It had belonged to his grandfather, and before that to a man named Vernon Blake. Between two carbon copies, he found a single page dated 1958. A black rectangle marked the southern field. Next to it, written in fading ink, were the words Sector C, approved for exploratory shaft. Below that was the name Tri-State Extraction. Jerome stared at the page until the letters blurred. He made a copy and left, gripping the paper as if it were a weapon. That night, he sat on the porch with a lamp beside him and studied the document again. The wind moved through the grass, whispering softly, and he thought of his grandfather working that same field, never knowing that beneath his boots, men had carved tunnels and taken what wasn't theirs. The anger came slowly, like heat building beneath the skin. The next morning, he drove north to the County Historical Society, a quiet building filled with dust and silence. The caretaker, an elderly man named Arthur Langford, listened carefully as Jerome showed him the map. When Langford saw the name Tri-State, his expression darkened. He told Jerome about a string of secret drilling operations that had taken place in the 1950s and 60s under different names: Tri-State Extraction, Midland Boring, Kendricks Energy. The companies came and went, changing titles, but always run by the same men. They drilled under private land without permission, hiding behind legal tricks and fake mineral rights. They never stopped, Langford said, his voice low. They just learned to hide better. He showed Jerome an old photograph of a drill site. Two men in coveralls beside a rig, the ground wet and black with oil. In the background stood a farmhouse that looked disturbingly familiar. Jerome leaned closer. It was his family's land. He left the building with copies of every document Langford would allow him to take. On the drive home, fury burned steady in his chest. The theft wasn't new. It had been buried for generations. That evening, he called Henry. The man's voice on the line was heavy, guarded. Jerome told him everything. The map, the company names, the photograph. Silence stretched on the other end before Henry finally said, "Then they've been under our feet the whole time." They agreed to meet the next morning, and Jerome knew then that his fear had turned into determination. This was no longer curiosity. It was about justice. When Henry's truck pulled into the drive, he wasn't alone. His niece, Kayla Springer, stepped out beside him, tall, calm, her face shadowed by determination. She was an environmental researcher, and she listened carefully as Jerome told everything, her eyes sharp with thought. "If what you're saying is true," she said, "this isn't just history. It's an active crime scene." She went to her truck and returned with a case of instruments, gas sensors, sample bottles, cameras. Within an hour, they were standing once more at the edge of the sinkhole. The sun blazed overhead, turning the air thick and shimmering. Kayla went down first, moving with practiced ease, her monitor beeping softly. Jerome and Henry followed, the earth swallowing them whole. The tunnel was worse than before. The smell of sulfur was almost unbearable, and the heat pressed close like breath. Kayla scraped a sample from the wall, her gloves glistening with oily residue. "Petroleum compounds," she murmured. "Unrefined." The tunnel widened as they moved deeper, and Jerome noticed that the black veins now glowed faintly beneath their light, pulsing like roots of something alive. They reached a section where metal ribs held up the walls. Old cables hung overhead, and puddles shimmered with a rainbow film. Then Jerome's foot struck something hard. Half buried in the soil was a rusted box. Together they pried it open. Inside were brittle papers sealed in plastic, schematics, technical diagrams, and blueprints marked with the name Kendricks Energy. The dates were recent, some less than 2 years old. Kayla spread one page against the wall, tracing the lines with her gloved hand. The network of tunnels stretched far beyond Jerome's property, threading under neighboring farms and into the county itself. "They're still operating," she said, "and you're standing right in the center." The realization hit Jerome like a punch. They had never stopped drilling. His family's land had been stolen, poisoned, used in secret, while they were told it was theirs. Kayla photographed everything, sealed the documents, and collected more samples. Her monitor beeped faster, warning of rising gas levels. "We need to move," she said. They turned back toward the shaft, following their steps through the shimmering fog. But as they neared the exit, the tunnel shook violently. A muffled roar rolled through the earth, followed by a blast of hot air that sent dust falling from the ceiling. The light behind them flared orange, and the ground jumped under their feet. Jerome grabbed Henry's arm as pieces rained down. When the noise faded, they looked back. A section of the tunnel had collapsed completely, buried under rubble and smoke. They climbed out in silence, coming up into a sky streaked with gray. The air above ground was stained by the same metallic smell, but now it carried something else, the unmistakable scent of explosives. From the ridge, a thin plume of black smoke rose from the southern field. Jerome stared at it, realization dawning cold and clear. "They blew part of it," he said. Kayla nodded grimly. "They're destroying evidence." Henry's fists tightened at his sides. "They're trying to scare us off." The three stood there, watching the smoke fade into the clouds. None of them spoke, but they all understood what it meant. Whoever was responsible was watching them, and whatever secrets the earth had kept buried were not meant to be found. The explosion changed everything. The southern field was scorched and silent, a black scar cutting across the once living soil. Jerome stood at the edge of the crater as smoke drifted in thin ribbons, the smell of burnt oil still thick in the air. Henry and Kayla joined him at sunrise, their faces grim and streaked with dirt. They didn't need to discuss what had happened. Someone had set off part of the tunnel to erase evidence and warn them to stop. But Jerome was beyond fear now. The farm he had spent his life protecting had been violated, and the only thing left was to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. They returned to the house, gathered their gear, and prepared to go back down before the site could be buried again. When they reached the sinkhole, the edges were still warm. Kayla tested the air with her monitor, nodding when the reading became stable. Without hesitation, she clipped her harness and began going down. Jerome followed close behind, flashlight steady in his hand, heart pounding but focused. Henry came last, carrying the camera and extra batteries. The tunnel was darker than before, the air thick and heavy. They moved in silence, every footstep echoing off the walls. Near the section where the explosion had sealed one passage, they found a narrow side path that sloped downward, half hidden behind a pile of rubble. The vibration in the ground returned, stronger now, accompanied by a faint hum that pulsed like a heartbeat. They followed it deeper until the tunnel opened into a huge room lit by cold white industrial lamps. Machines filled the space, pumps, pipes, and tanks slick with oil. A control panel blinked in the center of the room, its screens displaying maps and pressure readings. 3 workers in blue jumpsuits moved between the equipment, their masks covering their faces. The logo on their sleeves was unmistakable, MLB. Jerome froze, then slowly raised the camera. The lens captured everything: the men, the machinery, the flow of oil through cracked pipes. Kayla photographed the panel, zooming in on the logo pulsing in the corner of one display, Kendricks Energy. The company name glowed like a confession. One of the workers spoke into a headset, complaining about pressure levels and mentioning a surface breach from last week. The words confirmed it. The explosion had been deliberate, one of many meant to hide their continued theft. Kayla moved to the side of the room and opened a metal cabinet. Inside were binders and record books marked with field coordinates and production data. She flipped through one, and her breath caught when she saw the numbers. They matched Jerome's property exactly. She photographed every page, her hands shaking as she worked. "We have enough," Henry whispered. But even as he spoke, a metallic clang echoed from across the room. One of the workers had turned and spotted them. A shout followed, then the pounding of boots on the metal floor. Jerome shoved the files into Kayla's pack and motioned toward the exit. They ran through the tunnel, flashlights bouncing wildly, the sound of pursuit closing in behind them. The air grew hotter as they climbed the slope, the hum of machinery fading into chaos. By the time they reached the rope, their lungs burned, and their clothes were soaked with sweat. They came out into daylight, gasping for air. No one followed. Henry cut the rope free, tossing it into the pit. Kayla dropped to her knees, clutching the bag of evidence as though it were something precious. Jerome looked over the field, his land, and felt a wave of grief and fury so sharp it left him trembling. "We're not stopping," he said. Kayla nodded. That night, they drove into the city. Kayla delivered copies of the footage and documents to a journalist she trusted. Another set went to an investigator at the State Environmental Bureau. Jerome backed up everything online, sending encrypted copies to multiple sources. By morning, the first images had appeared on the news. Photographs of tunnels, oil pumps, and men in corporate uniforms beneath farmland. The headline read, "Hidden Extraction Network Exposed." The response was immediate. Officials arrived by noon, followed by investigators in plain clothes. Trucks rolled onto the farm carrying survey equipment and cleanup gear. The once quiet fields became a maze of tents, cables, and flashing lights. Jerome watched from the porch as strangers in protective suits marked the soil and drilled test cores. It felt surreal, like watching his life replay through someone else's eyes. Within days, the story spread beyond the county. Major networks ran the footage. Environmental groups called for accountability, and legal teams began tracing the chain of ownership behind Kendricks Energy. Arrests came soon after: a regional project manager, an engineer, a logistics officer. One of them confessed, naming higher executives and confirming decades of secret operations hidden beneath privately owned farms. Jerome stayed mostly silent. He gave his statement to the investigators, told them what he had seen, and left it at that. Reporters camped by his gate, but he refused interviews. For him, it wasn't about fame. It was about making sure no one could steal from the land again. Over the following weeks, the tunnels were sealed, and the contaminated soil was removed. Kayla oversaw a restoration team that treated the groundwater and strengthened the weakened areas of the southern field. Henry helped where he could, though both men had aged years in a matter of days. When the government announced that payment funds would be given to affected farmers, Jerome accepted the support for cleanup but rejected the private settlement offers from Kendrick's lawyers. No amount of money could erase what had been done. Months passed, the seasons turned, and slowly the land began to heal. Wildflowers appeared along the repaired fence line. and the cattle returned to grazing without fear. The soil no longer smelled of sulfur, only of earth and rain. One afternoon, Jerome walked the boundary of his field, pausing near the filled crater. The wind rustled through the grass, and for the first time in a long while, it sounded like peace. He knelt, pressing his hand to the ground, feeling its warmth. The scars would remain, but so would the truth. Later, the town honored him for his courage, presenting him with a small plaque at the courthouse. Jerome said little, only that the land remembers everything we bury in it. And sooner or later, it speaks back. A year later, the farm was alive again. Rows of corn rose high under the summer sun. Bees moved lazily between blossoms, and the sound of life returned to the soil. In the evenings, Jerome sat on his porch with a glass of tea, watching the sky fade into orange and gold. The pain had dulled, replaced by a quiet strength. He thought of his father and grandfather, of all the years their faith in the land had been betrayed, and felt a kind of closure. The ground beneath him was whole again. It had forgiven, but not forgotten. And Jerome Hale, once just a farmer, had become its voice. Some secrets refused to stay buried. What Jerome found was only the beginning. The question is, how deep does it really go? Like the video? Subscribe for the next part, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The story isn't over yet.